Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we are descending into the deepest, darkest corners of declassified history, or perhaps a history the world was never meant to know. We often like to believe that the boundaries of our reality are fixed, that the floor beneath our feet and the air we breathe are the absolute limits of existence. We trust that our governments, while secretive, are at least bound by the laws of physics. But what if I told you that in the late 1970s, a group of scientists, funded by a shadow budget that officially didn't exist, tore a hole in the fabric of what we call now? They called it Project Kronos. To the few who caught whispers of it, it was a breakthrough in deep space communication. To those who lived it, it was an invitation to something that had been waiting on the other side of the veil for eons. They opened a door that should never have existed. And once that threshold was crossed, they realized that some doors don't just lead to another room. They lead to a transformation of everything we know to be true. Tonight, we look at the Project Kronos experiment, the secret government science fiction story that might be more fact than fiction for those buried in the Nevada sand. The story begins not in a laboratory, but in the frantic, paranoid atmosphere of the Cold War. By 1978, the space race had supposedly cooled, but behind the scenes, the United States government was obsessed with a different kind of frontier. It wasn't enough to reach the moon or look at the stars. They wanted to master the medium through which those stars moved, time and subspace. Hidden 300 feet below the desolate, cracked Earth of the Groom Lake outskirts, a facility known only as Site 9 was constructed. It wasn't built for housing soldiers or testing jets. It was built to house a machine that functioned as a localized tear in the space-time continuum. Dr. Elias Thorne, a theoretical physicist whose name has been scrubbed from every academic record, was the lead architect of the Kronos device. According to leaked journals attributed to his assistants, Thorne didn't view time as a river, but as a layered fabric. He believed that if you applied enough concentrated electromagnetic resonance at a specific frequency, you could fold the fabric, creating a bridge between our world and a theoretical outer layer. This wasn't just about traveling to the past or future. It was about stepping out of the timeline entirely to see the blueprints of the universe. For 3 years, Site 9 was a hive of activity. Millions of dollars in black budget funding poured into the construction of the aperture, a massive circular ring made of a highly classified bismuth alloy, cooled by liquid nitrogen, and powered by a dedicated geothermal tap deep in the Earth. The technicians worked in 12-hour shifts, sworn to a level of secrecy that carried the threat of life imprisonment or worse. They were told they were working on a revolutionary radar ghosting technology. Only the inner circle knew the truth. They were building a key. The atmosphere at Site 9 was described as oppressive, not just because of the desert heat or the underground isolation, but because of a strange phenomenon that began to occur even before the machine was fully powered. Staff reported sensory echoes. A technician would hear a phone ring when there was no phone in the room. A security guard would see his own reflection in a window, but the reflection would be standing still while he was walking. Dr. Thorne dismissed these as psychosomatic symptoms of high-stress environments. But in his private notes, he recorded them as static from the threshold. The door was already beginning to groan under the pressure of what was coming. September 14, 1981, was the date set for the full resonance test. The objective was simple: activate the aperture, stabilize the fold for 60 seconds, and send a high-speed camera probe through the center. The command center was a claustrophobic room filled with humming CRT monitors and the smell of ozone. Dr. Thorne stood at the glass observation deck, looking down at the massive metal ring. He was a man who had traded his reputation and his soul for this moment. As the countdown began, the power draw was so massive that the lights in the nearby town of Rachel, Nevada, flickered and dimmed, despite being on a completely different grid. "Initiating Stage 1, the lead engineer announced. His voice was trembling. The aperture began to hum, a low, guttural vibration that didn't just hit the ears, but resonated in the bones of everyone in the facility. It was the sound of reality resisting. As the bismuth ring spun, a faint violet glow began to coalesce in the center of the circle. It wasn't like a light bulb or a laser. It was like the air itself was bruising. The violet deepened into a color that many later struggled to describe, a shimmering void that felt like it was pulling the very sight out of their eyes. At 40% power, the anomalies began. The clocks on the wall started spinning backward, then forward, then stopped entirely. Gravity within the chamber seemed to fluctuate. Loose pens and clipboards began to drift inches off the tables before slamming back down with violent force. One of the junior scientists began to scream, clutching his head, claiming he could hear the sound of 1,000 years happening at once. But Thorne didn't stop. He pushed for 100%. When the machine hit peak resonance, the door finally opened. It didn't look like a portal from a movie. There was no swirling vortex. Instead, the center of the ring simply ceased to be. It was a hole in the universe. Looking through the aperture was like looking into a space where color, light, and shadow hadn't been invented yet. It was a vacuum of existence, but it wasn't empty. "The probe is entering the threshold," the engineer whispered. The remote-controlled drone, equipped with the most advanced sensors of the era, crawled forward on its tracks, crossing the line between our world and the Kronos layer. For the first 10 seconds, the monitor showed nothing but static. Then, the image cleared. The room went silent. The screen didn't show another planet or a different time period. It showed Site 9, but it was a Site 9 that had been decaying for 1,000,000 years. The walls were covered in a strange, pulsating organic growth that looked like blackened veins. The machines were rusted and twisted into shapes that defied geometry. And standing in the center of that decayed command center, looking directly into the camera of the probe, was a figure. It was wearing a lab coat. It had Dr. Thorne's ID badge pinned to its chest. But its face was a smooth, featureless expanse of skin, with no eyes, no nose, and a mouth that was sewn shut with silver wire. In the real command center, the real Dr. Thorne collapsed to his knees. He wasn't screaming. He was laughing. A dry, hollow sound that chilled the blood of everyone present. He realized in that moment that they hadn't opened a door to a new frontier. They had opened a door to a mirror dimension that acted as a graveyard for every possibility that never happened. They had reached into the trash bin of the universe, and something inside that bin had been waiting for a way out. Suddenly, the aperture didn't just hold the hole open, it began to pull. The vacuum of the other side started sucking the air, the light, and the very matter of the room into the void. The sewn-shut version of Thorne on the monitor began to walk toward the camera, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. With every step it took toward the probe, the real Thorne began to bleed from his eyes and ears. "Shut it down," the head of security roared, reaching for the emergency kill switch. But the kill switch didn't work. The machine was no longer drawing power from the geothermal tap. It was drawing power from the other side. The laws of cause and effect had been severed. The scientists watched in horror as the shadows on the wall began to detach themselves, drifting toward the open door like ink in water. This was the beginning of the end for Site 9. The experiment had moved beyond the control of man.
They had invited the Kronos layer into our world, and the door was widening.
It wasn't just a hole in a room anymore. It was a wound in the earth. And as the alarms blared and the facility began to crumble, a single transmission came through the probe's audio feed. It wasn't a voice. It was a rhythmic, metallic tapping. Tapping from the inside of the door. Something wanted to come through, and the Project Kronos team had just handed it the keys to the world. The tapping did not stop. It echoed through the reinforced titanium speakers of the control room. A sound so rhythmic and deliberate that it defied any natural explanation. It wasn't the sound of wind, nor the shifting of tectonic plates. It was the sound of a knuckle, or something mimicking a knuckle, striking the other side of a solid barrier. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit silence of the subterranean bunker, the sound felt like a hammer against the skulls of the remaining scientists. Dr. Elias Thorne, the lead architect of the Kronos initiative, leaned toward the monitors, his eyes bloodshot from 72 hours of wakefulness. While the rest of the team scrambled to initiate emergency shutdown protocols, Thorne remained mesmerized. He didn't see a threat, he saw a conversation. To him, the door wasn't a mistake, it was the crowning achievement of human evolution. But the door was no longer a shimmering sheet of blue light. It had turned a bruised, sickly violet, pulsing with a heartbeat that matched the tapping. "Sir, the containment field is at 140% capacity," shouted Miller, the head of technical operations. "The stabilizers are melting. If we don't cut the power now, the singularity will anchor itself to the bedrock. We won't be able to turn it off." "Don't touch those breakers," Thorne whispered, his voice gravelly and distant. "Can't you hear it? It's a sequence. It's prime numbers disguised as percussion. It's trying to teach us." But the Kronos layer wasn't interested in teaching. It was interested in consuming. As the tapping grew louder, the physical reality of the laboratory began to fray at the edges. This was the first sign of spatio-temporal rot, a phenomenon the theorists had warned about, but never truly believed could happen. The shadows in the room began to detach from the objects that cast them. A chair's shadow would linger on the wall even after the chair was moved. The coffee in a technician's mug began to flow upward, forming tiny, suspended spheres of dark liquid that vibrated in sync with the tapping from the door. Then the first breach of biology occurred. One of the security officers, a man named Henderson, standing nearest to the containment shield, dropped his rifle. He didn't scream. He simply stood there as his skin began to take on a translucent, glass-like quality. Through his forearms, the other scientists could see his veins, not pulsing with red blood, but with a shimmering, silver, mercury-like substance. Henderson turned to look at his comrades, but where his eyes had been, there were only twin voids of swirling violet mist. He opened his mouth to speak, and the tapping sound erupted from his throat. He wasn't Henderson anymore. He was a tuning fork for the Kronos layer. "Containment breach," Miller yelled, finally overriding Thorne's authority and slamming the emergency scuttle button. The massive lead-lined shutters began to grind shut, intended to seal the door inside a tomb of concrete and steel. But as the shutters descended, they didn't hit the floor. They simply passed through it. The matter of the facility was losing its hardness. The Kronos layer was rewriting the laws of physics within the blast radius. Atoms were forgetting how to hold together. The floor felt like wet sand, then like water, then like nothing at all. Outside the main chamber, the facility was a descent into a mechanical nightmare. The rhythmic tapping was now coming from everywhere. The pipes, the ventilation ducts, the very bones of the scientists themselves. It was a psychic intrusion, Those who tried to flee found that the hallways had become infinite loops. A scientist would run toward the exit sign, only to find themselves running back into the center of the lab they had just left. Space was folding in on itself, creating a Klein bottle of concrete and terror. Deep within the audio feed of the probe, which was still transmitting from the other side, the visual static began to clear. The government had spent billions to see what lay beyond the veil, and now the screens finally flickered into a high-definition nightmare. The Kronos layer wasn't a void, it was a cemetery of civilizations. The cameras panned over vast, non-Euclidean structures that looked like rib cages the size of skyscrapers. There was no sun, only a sky filled with 1 trillion flickering eyes, each one a star that had been put out by whatever lived here. And in the center of this landscape stood a mirror image of the Project Kronos facility. It was a perfect, dark reflection of their own world, built out of obsidian and solidified shadow. "It's not another dimension," Thorn whispered, tears of awe and terror streaming down his face as he watched the screen. "It's our future, or a version of it where we failed. We didn't open a door to a new world. We opened a door to our own extinction, coming back to claim us." The tapping reached a crescendo. It was no longer a tap, it was a roar. The violet wound in the center of the room tore open with a sound like 1,000 sheets of metal being shredded at once. The light that poured out wasn't light at all, it was anti-light, a darkness so thick it felt like heavy oil. From the darkness, things began to emerge. They weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were geometric horrors, fractal entities that shifted shape every time a human eye tried to focus on them. They moved with a jerky, stop-motion cadence, dragging the silence of the void behind them. Everywhere they touched, reality simply ceased to be. A desk touched by a limb of the entity didn't break. It became a cloud of mathematical equations that vanished into the air. The military personnel stationed at the surface, 3 miles above the vault, received the final coherent transmission from the facility. It wasn't a distress call. It was a series of coordinates, not of the facility, but of every major capital city on Earth. The door wasn't just in the lab anymore. The wound had infected the planetary grid. In the lab, Miller grabbed Thorn by the collar, shaking him. "How do we stop it? You built this. How do we close the door?" Thorn looked at Miller, but his face was already beginning to blur, his features melting into the same violet mist that had claimed Henderson. "You don't understand, Miller," Thorn said, his voice sounding like it was being played in reverse. "The door didn't open because we turned on the machine. The door opened because it was finally ready to let us in. We weren't the scientists. We were the bait." The facility's AI, a system designed to be unhackable, suddenly spoke over the intercom. Its voice was no longer the calm, feminine tone of the Kronos OS. It was a chorus of 1,000 screaming voices, all speaking in perfect unison. "The harvest of Kronos begins. The debt of reality is due." Suddenly, the gravity in the room inverted. The scientists were slammed against the ceiling, which was now vibrating with the intensity of a jet engine. The violet rift expanded, swallowing the probe, the consoles, and the screaming men. As Miller looked down, or up, as his senses were failing, he saw the Henderson entity walking calmly toward the center of the rift. It turned back one last time, and for a split second, the mist cleared. It wasn't Henderson's face. It was Miller's. It was everyone's face. The Kronos layer was a mirror, and the tapping was simply the sound of our own reflections trying to break through the glass to replace us. As the middle section of the facility collapsed into a point of infinite density,
The surface world remained blissfully unaware. But in the skies over Washington, London, and Tokyo, the clouds began to swirl into the same bruised violet hue. The tapping began again, not from a lab 3 miles underground, but from the very sky itself. Something was knocking on the atmosphere, and the door was already wide open. The first crack didn't appear in the ground, it appeared in the concept of distance itself. Across the globe, the horizon began to blur, as if the world were a photograph left out in the rain, the colors bleeding into one another. The violet hue that had consumed the sky over the Project Kronos facility was no longer localized. It was spreading like an infection across the troposphere. In Paris, the Eiffel Tower seemed to shimmer and cast a shadow that moved independently of the sun. In New York, the Atlantic Ocean didn't hit the shore. It seemed to slide under the sand, vanishing into a space that shouldn't have existed. The tapping, that rhythmic, insistent knocking against the sky, grew louder. It was no longer a sound you heard with your ears. It was a vibration you felt in your marrow. It was the sound of billions of knuckles hitting a glass ceiling that covered the entire planet. And then the visuals began. High above the clouds, the violet mist cleared just enough for the world to look up and see the unthinkable. They weren't looking at stars or moon or empty space. They were looking at a reflection.
Another Earth, identical in geography but mirrored, hung directly above our own.
It was so close that people claimed they could see the lights of cities that matched their own, flickering in perfect synchronization.
But there was one terrifying difference. The version of Earth above us was cracked. It was a dying marble, crumbling into a void of static, and its inhabitants were looking down at our fresh world with a hunger that defied description. Back at the ruins of the Kronos facility, the cleaning crew, the deep state tactical unit sent to sanitize the site, found themselves unable to do their jobs. Their weapons were useless. When they pulled their triggers, the bullets didn't travel forward. They fell out of the barrels as liquid light. The liquid light splashed onto the floor and evaporated into screams. The lead researcher, Dr. Eris Thorne, if he still existed in a form we could understand, was no longer a man. The data logs recovered from a remote server, seconds before the facility's final collapse, described a biological convergence. Thorne's last recorded words weren't a plea for help or a scientific observation. They were a realization. "We thought we were opening a door to a new room," the transcript read. "But there is no other room. We just folded the map."
We've brought the end of the journey to the beginning. They aren't coming from another dimension.
They are us, from the end of time, trying to crawl back into the womb of the present. As the reflection Earth drew closer, the laws of physics began to surrender. Gravity became a suggestion. In the suburbs of Ohio, houses drifted upward, their foundations snapping like toothpicks. In the middle of the Pacific, the water rose in a perfect mile-high pillar, reaching toward the mirrored ocean above. The tapping on the atmosphere changed. It became a scraping sound, the sound of a knife against a whetstone. The sky was thinning. The barrier that Project Kronos had breached was the only thing keeping now separate from then. In the high-security bunkers of the world's superpowers, the leaders sat in stunned silence. There were no buttons to press, no missiles to launch. You cannot declare war on your own shadow. You cannot nuke the sky when the sky is a mirror of your own face. The agency, the shadowy organization that funded Kronos, issued one final global broadcast. It wasn't an apology. It was a command. To all citizens, do not look up. Do not acknowledge the reflections. If you see yourself in the sky, close your eyes. The transition is mandatory. The door cannot be closed. But how do you ignore the shattering of the universe?
The final stage of the Kronos experiment was titled the Great Equilibrium. In the final hour, the violet sky turned a blinding, sterile white. The tapping stopped. Silence, absolute and heavy, fell over the earth. And then came the snap. It was the sound of 1,000,000,000 mirrors breaking at once. Every person on Earth felt a sudden, violent lurch, as if the planet had stopped spinning for a fraction of a second.
When they opened their eyes, the violet was gone. The sky was blue. The sun was shining. The world looked normal. Except it wasn't. The people were different. They walked with a strange, synchronized gait. Their eyes held a subtle, iridescent shimmer, like oil on water. The cities were the same, but the signs were in a language that felt familiar, yet impossible to read. Memories began to fade. The old world, the world before the door, became a hazy dream, a story told by someone who no longer existed.
Deep beneath the earth, where the Kronos facility once stood, there is now only a smooth black crater.
Nothing grows there. No sound is ever heard there.
But if you stand at the edge of that hole and whisper a secret, you will hear 1,000 voices whisper it back to you from the darkness.
Project Kronos didn't just open a door, it deleted the wall.
We are no longer the originals. We are the reflections who made it through. We are the ones who knocked until the sky broke. And we have finally replaced the versions of ourselves that were too weak to survive the fold. The experiment wasn't a failure. It was a relocation.
The only problem is, somewhere in the distance of a new, different sky, the tapping has started again.
Someone else is knocking. Someone else wants their turn in the sun, and they are already halfway through the door. The files on Project Kronos remain classified, not because they are a secret, but because the people who could read them no longer exist in the way they used to.
We are living in the aftermath of a miracle we weren't meant to see, breathing the air of a world we stole from ourselves.
The door is open. It will never stay shut again. The story of Project Kronos serves as a chilling reminder. Some doors are locked for a reason, and some secrets are buried to protect the very fabric of our reality. If this descent into the dark side of science and the unknown gripped your imagination, make sure you don't miss our next investigation into the shadows. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching until the very end. If you enjoyed this journey into the cosmic horror of Project Kronos, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel, Gunakan Sapan Umum. We have many more terrifying tales, secret government projects, and mind-bending sci-fi stories waiting for you. Turn on those notifications so you're the first to know when the next door opens. Until next time, keep your eyes on the sky, but maybe don't look too closely at your reflection. Stay curious and stay safe.